The night over San Luis Valley split with a flash without thunder. Radios went silent, the wind froze, and everything sank into unnatural stillness. By dawn, only a circle of pressed grass remained, a trace of something that came and left, leaving behind silence that could not be silence. The San Luis Valley in southern Colorado stretched wide beneath the night sky, a basin of cold air cupped between the Sangre de Cristo Range and the San Juan Mountains. Its high desert plain, filled with scrub, cottonwood groves, and abandoned irrigation ditches, had long been used as a convenient passageway for military aviation. Pilots called it the corridor, a straight path across the continent where air currents stayed steady and the distance between mountains created a natural highway of sky. By the mid-1990s, sorties passed with less frequency than during the height of the Cold War, but radar controllers in Albuquerque still kept their scopes tuned to the sectors. To them, the valley remained an airway, open and silent, even when nothing moved through it. On the evening of October 14, 1995, at precisely 22:31 Mountain Daylight Time, the scope operators at Sector 72 registered a brief anomaly. Two civilian aircraft transiting at low altitude vanished from their screens, not because of clutter or storms, but against an atmosphere that looked unnaturally clean. For 5 minutes, the familiar texture of radio noise dropped away from the record. Normally, there was always a haze of static and intermittent spikes, the invisible breathing of the spectrum itself. But in that window, the line on the recording flatlined into emptiness. Voice transmission continued, faint but intact. Pilots who spoke across the channel noted that high frequencies felt swollen, bloated, almost muffled, though they did not lose contact entirely. In the logbook marked ZB72, the controller entered a simple note: 5 minutes of silence in the spectrum. Far below, at the same time, a maintenance electrician employed by the Castilla County Cooperative checked his instruments on a remote branch line. The gauges showed a sudden voltage sag of 7% on a 14 kilovolt line. There had been no storms, no sudden demand, and no obvious failure in the system. He marked the reading, noted the time, and moved on. The skies above the valley remained clear. Winds were low, pressure was steady, and visibility under the moonless stars extended for miles. To anyone standing outside, the air felt still, as if held in place by something unseen. By 22:44, the sheriff's department began receiving calls. In the duty log of that night, a clerk added a short entry about a light hanging over the northern slope of Blanca Peak. Reports from the foothills were uncommon. Most late-night calls came from ranchers asking for help with stray cattle or motorists stranded along the highway. This time, however, a resident described a motionless glow above the pasture north of the town of San Luis. The dispatcher recorded the words but offered no interpretation. 3 minutes later, a recording line attached to the county's emergency channel caught the first rumble. It was not a voice but a low vibration, a deep frequency hum that swelled across the band. For a few seconds, it dominated the audio, filling the line with a resonance that carried no modulation, only tone. Then it faded into silence. Patrol Unit 214 left the small substation and drove into the backcountry roads, headlights carving narrow tunnels through sage and dust. The officer marked distances in a notebook as he passed wooden mile markers. In his vehicle's radio, the VHF band collapsed into a running bar of static, a shimmering trace without carrier. Transmissions from dispatch arrived only as faint clicks of open carriers without voice. The officer noted each point in his log as the gravel road curved northward toward the pastures beneath Blanca. Meanwhile, the nearest meteorological outpost belonging to NOAA in Alamosa, 30 miles away, registered an unexplained failure. At 22:45, the cup anemometer needle fell to zero, as if the wind itself had ceased. The lapse lasted 40 seconds before the instrument returned to its prior level. Cross-reference with a second station revealed that wind continued without change, only a few miles distant. Something had touched the sensors, leaving a gap of pure nothingness. The observation went unremarked, except as a maintenance anomaly, yet in combination with other logs, it formed a pattern. The pattern spread like a moving band of absence, a corridor of silence traveling diagonally across the valley from northeast to southwest. It was not a storm front, nor an electromagnetic burst, nor a simple equipment malfunction. Each agency saw only its own fragment, a vanished radar trace, a sagging voltage, a collapsed anemometer, a low rumble across emergency frequencies. No one combined them that night. In the moment, they remained separate marks in separate ledgers, scattered across offices and stations. In the town itself, the night continued as usual. The lights of a few gas stations glowed along the highway. Trailers and ranch houses sat under the stars, and the cottonwoods along the Rio Culebra stood still in the dark. Yet, above the open basin, something vast and unmarked passed. The sky did not roar, it did not flare. It only seemed to press down with a heaviness that settled across roofs, fields, and ridges. Dogs along the outskirts of San Luis stirred and barked, not at a sound, but at its absence. Horses in fenced paddocks shifted and stamped without cause. Insects, usually a constant drone, fell quiet. The silence became layered, unnatural, as if it carried weight of its own. The sheriff's patrol vehicle moved further from the town, its headlights brushing over old fence lines and rusted equipment abandoned in the brush. The officer slowed near a dirt track and switched off the engine. He wrote down the time and listened. The hum he had heard earlier did not return, but the air itself felt strained, stretched thin. He stepped out and noted that the stars above the horizon seemed blurred, as if a faint shimmer moved between them and the ground. The record of his log, later filed, described the sensation not as sound, not as light, but as density in the air, a pressure unaccompanied by measurable change in weather. At nearly the same moment, a weather observer at the Alamosa airfield radioed in his final hourly report. He noted clear skies, visibility unrestricted, and temperature steady. What he did not note, because no instrument recorded it, was the quiet shift that crossed the valley just after he locked the logbook. Over Blanca Peak, the faint light described by the first caller remained, an amber presence just above the ridgeline, fixed and unshifting. It left no streak, no flare, only a glow that seemed both close and distant at once. Across the scattered records of that night, the description repeated itself in silence. The spectrum fell quiet, the power lines sagged, the anemometer stopped, the patrol car's radio thinned into emptiness. A corridor had opened across the San Luis Valley, not carved by storms or planes, but by something that moved without name. It left behind no clear trace, only the scattered notations of men and women who marked anomalies in their books and moved on. What passed above them was unacknowledged, unchased, unseen, but not unfelt. The valley held its silence and the night resumed. The stars shone again, the wind returned to the instruments, and the cattle settled back into their pastures. But within the official logs, the 5-minute window remained, an absence that no one explained. It was recorded as silence, yet in that silence lay the first step of something larger, a night corridor that carried more than wind and sky. The first physical observations came from those closest to the ground. A road worker driving a pickup along State Route 159 at 22:56 Mountain Daylight Time noticed that his headlights failed to produce the usual retro reflection from roadside signs. The familiar metallic glitter vanished, and the painted white lines dulled to a flat surface. For less than a minute, the world ahead absorbed light rather than returning it. Then the reflectivity returned without a click, step, or flicker, as if an unseen plate had been lifted away from the air itself. On the edge of San Luis, a motion sensor woke a yard floodlight. Neighbors who happened to look outside later described a narrow column rising from the lamp straight into the dark, a tight shaft without scatter, as though the atmosphere had thickened and lost its dust. The local clinic stood nearly empty at that hour. At 23:12, the triage nurse recorded a walk-in complaint from a woman who reported sudden nausea and an unnerving absence of bodily sound in her own head, where the pulse usually drummed faintly. Vital signs stayed within normal ranges and the oximeter showed a steady saturation. In the intake room, an old medical refrigerator that usually filled the background with a soft compressor whir fell silent. The room felt colder by touch but registered a stable temperature. The noise did not return before the end of the shift. A maintenance electrician called the next afternoon found no blown fuses, no weak capacitors, and no burned windings. The nurse's entry remained a single line in a long book. The message from the Albuquerque Air Route Center about briefly lost returns did not escalate. At 23:20, the tower at Alamosa confirmed no unknown traffic, and the 3 small aircraft on frequency reported clear air and routine beacons. The sheriff's office downgraded the earlier report of a glow over the Blanca slope to a vehicle on the foothill road and closed the call. In neighboring Conejos County, 2 hunters camping on public land wrote a single sentence in a field notebook about a star that did not move with either head turn or binocular sweep. They did not place a call. They marked the time and the general direction the way a person marks a moose track along the edge of a snowy meadow, with precision but without urgency. Unnoticed by most, the central office in Alamosa logged an unusual burst of errored seconds on a long microwave hop that carried part of the valley's long-distance telephone traffic. The digital switch noted a short run of slips and one brief loss of frame that lasted less than the time required to add another line on a paper log. The error counter cleared by itself. A paging transmitter on the east side of town missed several scheduled group calls in the same window. The printed report the next morning described them as late pages with successful retransmission. The overnight technician underlined the times and added no comment. In Monte Vista, a licensed amateur radio operator kept a written log beside his transceiver, as he had done for decades. On 40 meters, the band fell away into a perfect floor of quiet. Not the usual summer thunderstorm hiss, not wintertime long-haul whispers, only a flat deadness that made the speaker sound unplugged. He tried 2 meters through a mountaintop repeater and heard the repeater's carrier tail hang on a shade longer than normal with no intelligible audio. He recorded the minute and the repeated attempts on the line reserved for unusual propagation. The airport's small weather station had no human witness standing over its instruments in the dark. A ceilometer ranged for cloud base and returned a narrow profile that looked more like a pencil stroke than a soft scatter. The printout later showed a brief period of anomalously low backscatter with no reported cloud layers, as if the beam passed through a medium less inclined to return light. The automated system marked the segment with a maintenance flag. When checked the next day, the device passed all tests. Out in the fields near Antonito, a night watchman made his rounds at the edge of a feedlot. The herd pressed against the lee fence without wind to drive them there. Several cattle stood with heads low and ears fixed forward, a posture the watchman had seen only during sudden storms. An irrigation pivot that had been set to creep a few yards each hour sat perfectly still. Its control box showed power present, the motor contactor untripped, and the timer wheel in the same notch it had occupied earlier. The rotation resumed sometime after midnight with no intervention. The county's public safety radio network, a VHF high band system tied together by a mountaintop site, behaved and misbehaved in ways that left little to write. Patrol units reported carrier tones without speech and a hollowing of audio that made voices sound as if they had detoured around the mountains rather than passing through the repeater. The automatic unit identifier tones that usually clipped on at the head of transmissions failed to register on several calls. Dispatchers wrote brief notations beside unit numbers and drew small circles around the times. Television signals in the valley tended to arrive by satellite and terrestrial relay into a small head end where they were restacked and delivered along coaxial lines. The night operator noted a shallow notch across a narrow slice of spectrum on a spectrum analyzer, there for less than a minute, invisible to viewers except as a short breath of fine snow on one distant channel. A VCR used to time shift the late news produced a tape with a few seconds of uniform gray instead of the expected scene change. The operator replaced the cassette, rewound the brief gap, and shrugged at the anomaly. A state highway maintenance truck, equipped with a new handheld global positioning receiver for mapping culvert locations, reported poor satellite geometry and intermittent lock for a short time while parked on a high spot above the river. The older paper map and magnetic compass only recorded direction without comment. Selective availability blurred consumer receivers in those years, and the crew chalked the hiccup to the usual limitations rather than adding an incident note. At a small substation west of San Luis, SCADA polling of a remote recloser failed to return a status packet within the usual window. The master station flagged the device as not responding and cleared the alert at the next pole with no alarms. In the morning, a line technician read the overnight alarm printout and initialed it as a transient. In the wide open fields north of town, a sprinkler cart's metal frame showed a soft halo in the yard light, as if the air hugged its edges more tightly than usual. Nearby, a shallow pond lay smooth under the starlight. The noise of insects that usually ringed its banks dimmed to a patchy rhythm and then went thin, leaving only the soft splashes of something small turning in the water. On a porch, a dog lifted its head and stared toward the ridge with ears forward and mouth closed, breathing air that seemed newly heavy. The sheriff's patrol unit 214 drove further out, its tires ticking over gravel. The officer tried the mobile data terminal twice. The display returned a string of asterisks and a blank input prompt, as if the machine had accepted a command from somewhere else and then changed its mind. The officer recorded the attempt. The notebook entry later looked like any other line, time, location, and result, but the gap between effort and record felt larger in the dark. Across the state line in a ridge shelter used by wildlife field staff, a stationary camera set to record a nightly time lapse of a meadow returned a strip of frames with a uniform brightness level that hid individual stars and left the horizon slightly washed, as though a thin fog had rolled in. Weather observers reported no fog anywhere in the valley that night. The frames before and after the strip showed sharp stars and the clean edge of mountains against the sky. The low rumble captured earlier on the emergency channel returned once more around 23:30. It rose out of the noise floor without warning, held a steady fundamental, carried a faint harmonic a few octaves above, and fell away in under 10 seconds. The recording system had no analysis tools beyond a clock and a tape. The duty supervisor marked the tape counter and turned the knob back a few turns to confirm that the sound was on the tape and not a change in the playback head. The second pass produced the same brief presence and the same clean silence afterward. A small AM station north of Alamosa kept an overnight program on autopilot at low power. Its transmitter log showed a slight reflected power increase for 3 minutes that the engineer later traced to nothing in the feed line or antenna tuning network. The ground system ohmed out properly the next morning, and the field strength meter still swung where it should. the head of security at a potato processing plant, walked the loading yard and noted that the sodium vapor lights along the east fence took longer than usual to warm from cold. Their orange deepened into a redder hue before climbing back to normal tint. The plant did not halt operations, and the hour's production tally matched the day before. A photographer in the valley who favored long exposure star trails set up his camera behind his home just before midnight. The trail image from that night included a smooth segment where the star arcs thinned, as though the emulsion had been exposed through a filter for a portion of the frame. No plane crossed to cause a flare, and no cloud left a soft edge. He filed the negative in a sleeve marked with the date and time and made no print from it. The cone of stillness moved across the basin in a line that could only be drawn in hindsight by connecting notes written in different hands. It touched metal and changed the way it returned light. It slipped through power and reduced it without load. It walked down the frequency bands and removed their breath. It pressed on animals with no audible sound and on people with no measurable force. It sat over Blanca and made a glow that did not waver and a shadow that did not move. In the Alamosa Tower, the controller on duty finished a 24-hour summary. The form asked for traffic counts, equipment status, and unusual events. The radar display had drifted once and was already corrected by a tech earlier that week. The controller checked the box that indicated normal operations. The checklist did not include a space for sudden quiet. In the small police records room, a clerk stapled the night's calls, 2 pages of routine service and 1 page of false starts. The glow over the slope lived as a single line with a close-out code that meant nothing found. The call time fell into the same column as a lost calf and a noise complaint. The lines shared ink and margin, but nothing else. At the utility yard, the duty apprentice folded the overnight SCADA printout into thirds and slid it into a binder. He added a sticky note on the cover that read, "Maintenance Review," with a day and time for a future meeting. The paper ended up between drawings of a substation bus and a typed service bulletin about recloser firmware. In the clinic, the morning shift found the refrigerator humming again. The triage nurse scribbled a brief addendum that the earlier silence had not repeated and filed the chart. The woman with nausea did not return that day. The electrician returned the key to the maintenance shelf and signed off. The amateur radio operator in Monte Vista turned his logbook to a fresh page and wrote a note to himself about trying again for a northeast contact at sundown the next day. The 2 hunters in Conejos County folded their notebook and tucked it under a camp stove. The highway worker made a pencil mark beside a warped sign and noted a request for replacement sometime within the month. The yard floodlight on the edge of San Luis clicked off near midnight when the timer wound itself past its set point. When it cycled again before dawn, the beam widened into its normal cone and scattered against the dust the way it had every morning before. By themselves, none of the entries carried meaning. Together, they described the shape of a cut in the fabric of the night. Across the San Luis Valley, connection loosened and retightened as if the world had flexed. The microphones and sensors that lived in the corners of human work caught the flex in passing and returned to routine. In the books remained the absence measured in seconds, scraps of spectrum, small percentages, and pencil strokes. The corridor that had opened earlier did not announce itself with a name. It only left the record of a link thinned to nothing and then drawn taut again. Morning brought into view what the night had left without form. On the northern edge of the Johnson pasture, near the bed of an abandoned irrigation ditch, a ring in the grass appeared. Its diameter measured roughly 6 meters, traced not by fire or charring, but by pressure that seemed to have pressed the stems downward. The grass within the circle showed a gradient of discoloration, paling toward the center as if subjected to sudden and intense drying heat without flame. Each stalk bent rather than broke, and when handled, the fibers crumbled as if baked from within. The soil beneath the ring felt brittle underfoot, carrying none of the moisture typical of early October mornings in the valley. Beside the ring sat a polyethylene salt bucket used to feed cattle. Its surface had turned opaque from the inside, as if light within the plastic reflected outward rather than through. The bucket no longer behaved like ordinary material. When the rancher poured water into it, the inner walls scattered reflections oddly, casting a muted glow that appeared to hover across the surface. Nothing burned, nothing smelled scorched, yet the polymer had been altered in a way that suggested heat without fire, energy without flame. At the neighboring ranch, milk collected that morning carried no scent. The usual sharpness of fresh dairy was absent. Poured into a pail, the liquid appeared normal in color and viscosity, but it smelled of nothing. The absence disturbed the family, who remarked only in their household notes that the milk has no smell today. They set it aside for calves, but even the animals hesitated before drinking. By mid-morning, the sheriff's department dispatched a deputy to document the circle. The patrol vehicle parked by the ditch, and the officer walked the perimeter slowly, writing down measurements and sketching the ring in a small notebook. He noted the absence of animal prints within the circle. Birds in the surrounding brush did not cross the boundary. A lone crow that landed nearby veered sharply when it approached the inner ring. The officer radioed back his notes and waited. By noon, 2 vehicles arrived bearing university emblems. A pair of agronomists stepped out carrying cases of instruments. One deployed a portable spectrophotometer, kneeling at the edge of the circle and clipping samples from the pale grass. He reported a measurable shift in reflectance in the near-infrared band, a deviation not typical for drought or frost. He logged the spectrum traces on a handheld device, printing narrow strips of paper as evidence. The second agronomist marked soil cores for later analysis. The ranch owner remained silent through the inspection. He stood with folded arms, glancing occasionally at his herd grazing at a distance. In his own private notebook, he recorded one observation: the cattle avoided the circle entirely. When driven near it, they slowed and curved their path around the ring. Dogs roaming freely across the pasture stopped abruptly at the edge, tails low, refusing to step inside. Their behavior was consistent across the day, as though an unseen barrier surrounded the circle. By evening, a request reached the Alamosa courthouse from Denver, directing that soil samples be transferred to the state laboratory. 4 sites were chosen, 3 inside the ring and 1 control sample from a point 50 meters away. The samples were sealed in plastic containers. By the time the containers reached the sheriff's office desk, a thin, translucent residue lined the bottom of one. It resembled dried gel or film. The following morning, the residue had vanished. The photographs taken the previous night showed only ordinary soil texture, the unusual coating absent. The containers remained, but their surfaces no longer displayed anomalies. The county utility inspected nearby power lines. No scorch marks, arcing, or circuit trips had been recorded. Line monitors showed no spike in current. Energy supply across the sector remained steady, confirmed by logs from the regional grid. The absence of electrical disturbance removed one familiar explanation. On the night of October 15th, further irregularities appeared in separate accounts. A tractor parked near the Johnson ditch registered an unexplained increase of 0.3 miles on its odometer despite standing idle. Its ignition key hung untouched on a hook, and fuel levels showed no change. The entry was written in the owner's maintenance log as a single line. Elsewhere, a family living along the eastern foothills noted that their kitchen clock had advanced by 6 minutes overnight. They had not reset it, and the power supply had not faltered, The hands had simply moved forward unaccompanied by any outage or surge. The anomaly carried no consequence beyond confusion, yet it was precise enough to mark. In a restored watermill repurposed as a storage barn, the flow through the channel behaved differently. The wheel turned with unexpected force, as if the pressure of the upstream pond had increased. Yet flow gauges installed by the owner reported no rise in volume. The water pressed harder without delivering more. By morning, the wheel slowed again, settling back into ordinary rhythm. These fragments of observation, an odometer's unexplained advance, a kitchen clock that leapt ahead, a water wheel that strained without cause, shared a single corridor of time. Between 2240 and 2320, each incident occurred, scattered across households and properties. None explained the others, yet each left a trace written in small notes, brief logs, or pencil marks. Together they described a narrow field of lowering, a zone where energy, time, and matter shifted subtly, invisibly, and returned to normal without sign. The ring in the Johnson pasture remained, its grass pale, its soil dry, its shape unmistakable against the field. No explanation held. Instruments measured, notebooks filled, cameras clicked, but what lay beneath the silence was not resolved. The field of lowering persisted only in residue, in absence, and in memory, marked by those who had stood there when the sun revealed what the night had left behind. By the third day, the isolated observations began to assemble into a pattern. The Colorado National Guard, which had been conducting routine night exercises across the eastern plains, redirected one aircraft toward the western edge of the valley after a message arrived from the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA's aggregated radar plots contained a single uncorrelated return hovering over an empty section of ground south of Blanca Peak. The return was inconsistent with any registered flight plan, military or civilian. The Guard deployed an F-16 fighter, flying at medium altitude with its lantern system activated. Later, when fragments of the FLIR recording were released under the Freedom of Information Act, the file appeared truncated at its start and end. Yet within the preserved segment, a peculiar image was visible. Against the warmed surface of the Earth, the sensors showed a cold point suspended without drift, a patch that absorbed rather than emitted. The engines of the fighter produced the expected bright flares of heat, while the object itself appeared as an even blot, consistent and motionless, as if it collected warmth instead of giving it. Pilots reported no visual contact. Their eyes traced only horizon and sky, but the instruments recorded what they could not see. During this same window, a civilian airliner on approach to Albuquerque International reported intermittent degradation in communications. In the recordings of the regional control frequency, a brief exchange was captured in which controllers noted non-standard weak contact. The transcript later revealed gaps where pilot responses vanished. Ordinarily, analog tape carried hiss or static to fill silence, but in this case, the missing sections were replaced by a flat void. Engineers who later studied the reels remarked that the intervals resembled a digital zero, precise and total, even though the medium had been magnetic tape. At ground level near San Luis, the circle in the Johnson pasture had been covered by sheets of transparent polyethylene to protect the samples. Underneath the plastic, the grass no longer produced its brittle crunch. Instead, it rustled softly, pliant but emptied of vitality. A student from the university's botany department measured the soil at various depths with a portable hygrometer. He recorded that moisture at the center of the circle was 5% lower than at the edges, despite uniform dewfall across the entire pasture. The difference resisted simple explanation. A handheld video camera, operated by another student, captured further irregularities. The lens revealed minuscule shimmering points of light above the pressed grass. They did not drift as insects would, nor pulse like dust caught in light. Instead, they flickered into being and vanished without trajectory, as though reflections were generated in empty air. The phenomenon persisted for several minutes. At exactly 180 seconds, the recording ended without human intervention. The camera stopped as if commanded. When the operator resumed, the machine created a new file labeled with a fresh sequence number, beginning again on the same fixed frame where the first file had ceased. The hardware showed no fault. The event remained unexplained. Elsewhere in the valley, an amateur astronomer in Alamosa prepared his telescope for the clear October skies. At the lower right edge of the horizon, a bright star appeared stationary. According to astronomical tables, Deneb should have occupied the position at that time, yet the brightness and spectrum did not correspond. Through his eyepiece, the object appeared sharper and steadier than stellar light, emitting a clean white radiance unsoftened by atmospheric turbulence. In his journal, he logged the coordinates with careful script, including the precise time and date. At the margin of the same page, he added a personal note. His dog had lain calmly at his side throughout his preparations. But the moment he aligned the telescope toward the anomalous star, the dog rose without sound, turned, and walked into the house, refusing to remain outside. The animal did not bark or resist. It simply left, as if aware of a presence its owner could not perceive. These scattered reports, an uncorrelated radar return, a cold blot on infrared sensors, a blank silence in recorded audio, a dehydrated core of soil, unsteady luminous points, and a star misaligned with the catalog formed nodes of an emerging geometry. They did not cross at random. They aligned in time, each event confined to the same narrow window of hours. Military flight logs, civilian communication tapes, student field notes, amateur observation journals, all bore timestamps within minutes of each other. Though each witness worked alone, their records synchronized into a pattern. The disparate instruments, radar, FLIR, tape recorder, hygrometer, video camera, telescope, spoke with one voice when arranged in sequence. In the days that followed, archivists would review the entries and note the convergence. But at the moment itself, those present only sensed that something external was pressing into alignment. Machines, animals, and people responded without coordination, yet in harmony, as if they had been tuned to a common rhythm. The synchronization did not reveal a cause. It revealed only a framework. Signals nullified to silence, objects recorded as cold when the ground was warm, grass drier in the center than at the edge, stars displaced from their expected path. Each element remained unresolved on its own, but together they suggested an intelligence capable of arranging not just space but sequence, of folding multiple systems into one interval. By the end of that night, the valley carried not only silence and circles, but symmetry. Observations separated by miles and disciplines coincided, their clocks drawn together to the same invisible metronome. It was not an accident of perception. It was a synchronization, measured and precise, as if the valley itself had been drafted into an experiment whose purpose remained concealed. 2 days after the events at the Johnson pasture, the first vehicles arrived without insignia. They came just after dawn, rolling quietly across the gravel road that led to the northern ditch line. 2 unmarked white trucks with box compartments halted beside the fence line, followed by a black sedan that stopped a short distance away. The men who stepped out wore field coveralls without patches or names. Their movements were practiced and efficient. They carried cameras, measuring poles, and heavy containers for soil. They spoke little to each other and not at all to the rancher. Without delay, they established a perimeter using thin flags on metal stakes, arranging the ring into quadrants like a survey grid. Each segment was photographed repeatedly, both at ground level and from a raised pole camera that clicked in intervals. The soil within each grid was scraped in shallow layers, collected carefully into sealed bags, and then transferred into the truck compartments. The pressed grass was cut in square samples, pressed between boards, and cataloged without explanation. The operation resembled an archaeological dig, though it unfolded with far greater speed. The owner of the pasture was approached only once. A clipboard was presented, a form signed quickly, and the sheet carried back into one of the trucks. No duplicate remained with him. He later recalled the paper only as an acknowledgement of transfer, but no copy could be found among his belongings. By midday, the field showed clean, bare patches where the sod had been lifted. The circle remained visible only as a faint outline. When the unmarked vehicles departed, the site looked less remarkable, as if erased deliberately. That same afternoon, a freight locomotive passed near San Luis, its horn echoing through the basin. For the first time in 3 days, the sound seemed abnormally loud. Residents remarked later that the valley had felt muted since the night of the event, though no one had measured it with instruments. Everyday noises, the barking of dogs, the rustling of trees, the engines of passing cars, had all carried a subdued quality, as if filtered through invisible material. When the locomotive's horn broke the hush, the contrast startled those who heard it. 3 weeks later, laboratory reports circulated quietly. The soil carried no traces of radiation beyond natural background. However, under microscope analysis, the samples revealed an unusual presence of quartz granules partially melted at their edges, forming glassy rims inconsistent with normal thermal exposure. These grains appeared in concentrations higher than the control samples, suggesting a brief but intense energy source. Electrical conductivity measurements on the soil showed values lower than expected, though organic matter content remained ordinary. No biological contamination was noted. At the same time, a bulletin from the Federal Aviation Administration included a short paragraph addressing the anomalies in Sector ZAB-72. It described a temporary loss of background noise across communications, noted that technical cause had not been determined, and concluded that no hazard to aviation safety had been identified. The language was restrained, and the paragraph was placed deep within the report, unlikely to draw notice. In the sheriff's office, a single sheet of paper was stored in a thin folder. Written by hand, it summarized the incident in 4 elements: flash, calls, steady hum, circle in grass. The note was plain, without embellishment, but its economy of language carried weight. When reviewed many years later by journalists and researchers, they noticed one particular word chosen to describe the sound. It did not say buzzing, nor wind, nor whistle. It said only steady. None of the witnesses had described turbulence or fluctuation. The sound, when it appeared, was flat, even unbroken. A hum without character, a presence without motion. The word steady became the only surviving descriptor of the noise that had crossed the valley. By the end of October, an internal memorandum circulated within Denver. Dated the 27th, it bore a heading that referenced correlated data sets. The content described coincidence of 3 observations: the loss of background static in the Albuquerque Center's radio spectrum, the measured reduction of ambient acoustic levels in the valley by Weather Service sensors, and the infrared recording of a cold point suspended over heated ground. Each element occupied its own system, yet the times matched. The final line of the memorandum carried a recommendation: do not escalate. The signature line bore the title of a senior position, but the personal name was obscured. The document ended there, leaving the convergence of soil anomalies, atmospheric silence, and thermal inversion unaddressed. What remained were extracted samples, erased grass, muffled sounds, and papers filed away with deliberate restraint. The valley returned outwardly to routine, yet beneath its surface the impression of removal persisted. Something had come, marked, measured, and taken. What remained was absence, logged in quiet reports and stored in cabinets where few would ever look. The winter of 1995 passed without incident. Snow layered evenly across the Johnson pasture, burying the circle beneath a white sheet that softened its outline until the thaw. By spring, the grass rose again, but within the circle the growth lagged. When the first mowing of the season came, the blades inside the ring stood shorter, thinner, and weaker than those beyond the boundary. They resisted the scythe with less force, and their cuttings carried a pale hue. The delay was noted in the rancher's log as an oddity of growth, though he did not share it beyond his household. He no longer allowed his dogs into the circle. He explained later that after standing in its center for 2 minutes, he could no longer feel the beat of his pulse in his wrist. The sensation did not hurt, it simply ceased. His hands retained warmth, yet the familiar throb in the veins was absent. He recorded the detail as a private note, a marker of something real but intangible. In one of the barns, an old radio was left unused. Before the event, it had tuned stations along the valley with faint static between frequencies. Afterward, it delivered only one constant sound. No matter the dial's position, it emitted a steady white noise, uniform from end to end of the spectrum. The family stopped switching it on. The machine remained in the corner, its dials frozen, a reminder of an absence rather than a presence. On the gravel road nearby, fragments of a tire remained where an officer's pickup had once jolted. The rubber, normally toughened and pliant, had hardened in patches until it fractured under pressure. The fragments felt brittle, as if exposed to frost, yet no freeze had touched the ground that night. The pieces remained by the roadside for years, their edges crumbling into dust each time a wheel passed over them. By 1998, attention shifted briefly when a small envelope arrived at the local library. It contained a file drawn from the National Archives under a Freedom of Information request. Inside were copies of FAA memoranda and 2 sheets of transcript from Control Center Communications. The transcripts carried no names or call signs. Where voices should have filled the gaps, there were only blank lines. A footnote explained that the recordings contained intervals of absent background level, described in plain terms as artificial silence. The words unsettled the librarian, who remarked only once that silence itself had been classified. Another sheet contained the state laboratory's summary of the soil. The report described microscopic quartz spheres, their edges softened as though melted and then cooled rapidly. The findings suggested brief exposure to extreme heat without the usual accompanying carbonization of organic matter. Grass had burned nowhere. The absence of scorch paired with evidence of heat produced a contradiction no line of the report resolved. Beyond these pages, no additional documents were included. The file ended abruptly. That same year, the university's campus newspaper printed a short article. The piece mentioned unusual soil samples and unexplained gaps in air traffic recordings. It offered no conclusions. Local officials reassured readers that no threat to safety or health had been identified. The matter faded quickly, leaving behind only curiosity among a handful of students. Life in the valley resumed its rhythm. Cattle grazed, freight trains passed, and children played on the edges of pastures. Yet at the old irrigation ditch, the strange column of light reappeared at intervals. Triggered by a yard sensor, a flood lamp projected upward. Instead of widening into a cone, the beam remained narrow, rising into the night without diffusion. Neighbors noted it occasionally but did not pursue explanation. Cameras aimed at the beam failed to capture its duration. Each attempt ended precisely at 3 minutes. The devices stopped, created new files, and resumed as though obeying unseen instruction. In the private notebook of a controller at the Albuquerque Center, a final entry remained uncatalogued. Without seal or official heading, it contained only one reflection. On the night of the event, he wrote, "The sector had grown unusually quiet, not in radio, not in conversation, but in the very air. The pocket of sky that carried words and signals had flattened into stillness. The silence had not hindered operations. It had simply existed, an evenness across the medium itself. After a time, it passed, leaving no trace but memory. The valley returned outwardly to routine. Yet those who had seen the circle, heard the hum, or felt the silence marked their notebooks in identical ways. Dates and times written plainly, then closed and filed away. Each witness kept their record without elaboration, as though words might diminish what had occurred. Years later, the grass within the circle continued to grow late. Dogs stepped into it only when commanded, never by choice. The earth bore no scar, but those who remembered carried one. What persisted was not proof, but presence, an enduring sense that beneath the surface of ordinary life, observation remained. It was passive, unannounced, and steady, like the silence itself.